Electronisounds Audio, the YouTube channel for you.
Hey guys, I've been having so much fun with the Groove Writer app, and the more I learn about it and the deeper I go, the more exciting it gets. So I was working on this techno drums pattern, right? And I've been exploring a lot of like step trigger conditions, and we're going to explore that today. Rather than show you how I built this beat, we're going to build a brand new custom beat from the ground up. But we're going to, do something techno-y, and we're going to, emulate what I've got here. Okay, so first things first, we're going to go ahead and start at an empty pattern, and let's go ahead and give this a name. We're going to hit shift and right, and we're going to rename pattern. For today's session, I'm just going to call this tech drums, and we'll go into the menu with the enter button here, and we're going to change the tempo. We'll go up to the pattern, and here we have the tempo. We're going to scroll this down to 117 beats per minute. We're going to leave the length at 1 bar. I do like a little bit of swing in my, music, even though there's not typically a lot of swing in techno music. We'll set that to say 5% for now, just for fun. Let's see. Let's change the scale. Let's go with like an F melodic minor. Okay, don't know that we're going to do any melodics today, rather. Let's see here. In the utilities, trying to set the quantize for us today. Settings. Okay. Record quantize note start. And we can do record quantize start and end. So the beginning of the note will snap to grid, and the end of any notes that we input will snap to grid as well. Sweet. We'll click pattern right, and we've saved that pattern as user 45 here. Changed our beat per minute, and we're ready to start writing. First thing I like to do a lot of the time is just to kind of in the mute mode, turn a lot of the tracks on and off, so that I'm not, I don't know, it's just sort of a personal workflow. And we're going to go into the kick pad, and we're going to make sure that the kick part is selected. This is part 9. You can see that, whoops, sorry about that. You can see that part 9 is selected here at the top. Okay. And what we'll do is, we can, if by default it puts a 4 on the floor kick drum pattern, we can see that if we click the sequence button. Okay, and as long as part 9 is selected, we can go ahead and, scroll through some different bass drums and stuff. I'm going to go ahead and choose the same bass drum that I used on the pattern that I showed you. A lot of cool bass drums here. We're going to use this rave bass drum. We're going to go into the amplitude envelope, and we're going to mess with these settings a bit. We'll turn the sustain down. Trying to get that sort of pull back that's built into the sound to, tame out just a little bit for us. That sounds pretty nice, so we'll go ahead and click right. The very next thing we're going to do, guys, is we're going to exit that menu. We'll go back into the... Okay, so in the mute screen, I'd like to work with this high. I'll just turn these back on down here in the mute screen. In the sequence section, I'd like to sequence out a hi-hat pattern. That's on part 13. So if we click the sequence button, we can see that we're already on part 13 here. If we weren't, I could, scroll to part 13 by using the part arrows here. And what I want to do is just put in a 16th note hi-hat. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're going to edit the velocity of these, and we're going to edit the step trigger conditions and get some interesting stuff going right off the jump in this hi-hat, and then we'll scroll through some sounds and do some cool stuff. So check it. If we go into the edit screen, we can see all of these notes here, right? And so if we tap anywhere on our sequence, the note changes, and we can change what that note is doing. Okay, so right off the jump, what I'd like to do is to bring the volume down on the hi-hats that are going at the exact same time as the kick drum, which is, 1, 2, 3, 4. So what I'll do is I'll just bring those down. Okay, so we'll click the next one that hits on the same, note as the kick drum, and we'll bring that down in velocity. This way we're leaving them in the mix, but we're still letting the kick drum, kind of be the driving force of the mix here. I'll start treating these next ones as groups of 3 that fill in the part after the downbeat. 1 da da da, 1 da da da, 1 da da da, 1 da da da, right? And then, so we'll take the velocities of these. I'll take like the second notes all down to 76. I hope this is making sense. And the third one's down to 86. And now, just right off the jump, we've got a little bit more of an exciting, dynamic happening in the hi-hats because we've adjusted the velocity here. Now, when you go into these notes, you can adjust the step length. You can adjust the velocity of each step. You can adjust the time shift of each step, which means you can kind of slide it on and off the grid a little bit. You can adjust the stroke, which is going to put more than one note in every time that hits. And then finally, you can adjust this step condition, which if you start pulling down, you'll see that it turns into a percentage number, right? And this is really handy. There's a whole bunch of other like things you can set this to besides just a percentage, but for today's tutorial we're just going to worry about the percentage on these. And what we want to do is for the hi-hats that hit with the kick drum, we're going to leave those alone, but for all of the other hi-hats we're going to assign a trigger condition %, so that they don't trigger all the time, and right off the jump the hi-hats become a living, breathing, moving part of the beat. So what we'll do here is 1, 5, 9, and 13. That's our 4 on the floor kick drum. So we'll start with the beats after those, and I'll make sure that I'm on the step condition, and I'm going to turn this down to like 30%, and I'm going to do that with all of the hi-hats that come directly after the kick drum. So now they're not going to play 100% of the time. There's only a 30% chance that these second notes are going to trigger. I'm going to do the same type of thing with the other notes. Everything that's not on the downbeat isn't going to trigger every single time. And that's going to, like you'll see, it's going to give our beat a total really breathing, moving, changing vibe when we're still at just a 1-bar beat. Okay, and so we've got the notes that are directly after the kick at 30, the notes after those at 40% chance. So again, here's the kicks, these are at 30. This is all just personal preference. I mean, there's not like a right or wrong way to do this. This is just, the way that I decided to try to do it, and it was sounding really good, so I'm showing it to you guys. Okay, and we'll make these all 50% chance. And so right off the jump, guys, check it. This hi-hat part is just completely evolving and changing in random, algorithms. Dope, let's put some reverb on this. Okay. Let's exit the menu. Let's write our pattern and don't forget to save, right? Let's go ahead and make it so we can use our multi-effects pad right off the jump. And that is if we, tell the kick drum that we don't want the multi-effects on. Now it's just going to be on the hi-hat. Cool. And so let's see here. What let's do is on the hi-hat part that we just put in with those trigger conditions and whatnot, let's go to the modulator section of this. Let's click type so that we can select what kind of modulation is going to happen on these hi-hats, part 13. You're going to always make sure when you're adjusting this section, and like say you think you're adjusting it for the cymbal or the part up here, just make sure that the number matches the part number that you're working on here, because you could accidentally click something and think you're still working on that hi-hat, but really now you're on part number 3. You follow? So it's just a good habit to get into, to always kind of cross-reference and make sure that you're on what you think you're on, you know. What we've got here is a whole section of modulators. Every single pad can have its own individual modulator, its own individual filter, its own effects here, and its own amplitude envelope as well. And what we're going to do to make these hi-hats super, you know, interesting and alive with movement is we're going to select, if you scroll down, we're going to select pitch to sample and hold BPM, okay? And what this is going to do is now the higher I turn the modulation depth up here, the more that's going to move the pitch around of our hi-hats and create some movement. Now check this out. If I press play, and we'll let's say by default I was having some pretty good luck with some, you know, relatively low speeds as to how fast this is going to move, so we'll set that to 20. I'll press play and I'll crank this depth up, and you'll hear the hi-hat changing pitch in sort of a random sample and hold way, but in time with the BPM of our track. This is like magic stuff, you guys. Check it out. Okay, so this is a pretty, I'll even make it more extreme for the example here. What essentially is happening is, you know, I'll go back into the sequence. We're not triggering all of these notes, right? It's a random thing. And now we've added a random pitch element to these random, you know, hi-hats as well. We can create like some more reverb on these, really get some sort of techno thing happening immediately right off the top. Bring these down a little bit in the mix. Okay, so we'll take the modulation depth down just a little so it's not quite so extreme in the amount of pitch movement that we're getting. It still sounds like a hi-hat, but now it's, really got some life and some movement to it. You can change the speed to your liking. I was really liking these at like a low speed, like 10, 15, 20 somewhat. Okay, so let's move on. If we let's go ahead and put a clap in. And again, we're going to use the step sequence mode for this. So we're going to click sequence. We're going to make sure that clap is selected, and we're going to put a clap on the 5 and 13 where the snare goes. At this point, you can make sure that it's we'll go back to trigger mode so you can see that on the clap here. Okay, we're on part 12. And if I click the wave button, we can now scroll through the claps here. I'm probably going to go with that 808 clap. But you get the idea. You could even import, your own sounds into here if you've got like your set of custom techno drums that you're really fond of. For now, let's just go with this 808 clap. And what let's do is do the same thing that we did with the hi-hat as far as the modulator for this 808 clap. We'll make sure that our part is on the correct part that we want it to be on, which it is, the clap. And we'll click modulator type at the top. Now by default, it'll be set to none. And we'll scroll down to the pitch section. And we'll select sample and hold BPM to the pitch. I'll set this speed to maybe like 15, so it's a little bit different, but relatively similar to the way that the hi-hat is moving. And we'll start cranking this up. Okay, now you can hear it changing the pitch of the clap every time it hits. And this is a random sort of, sample and hold LFO. And what we'll do is we'll bring this down to that it's just very, very subtly affecting that clap. You can it's subtle, you can barely hear it, but this beat is now getting some movement that would otherwise, not be there, and it'd be a little bit more stale. So we'll go ahead and exit the menu, and we'll save here. Now the reason that I didn't assign any sort of trigger conditions and make that clap not hit every time is because I feel like, we definitely want to keep a beat solid and keep the rhythm, solid. So I'm going to leave the kick drum without any variation, and I'm going to leave like the clap without any variation. And what we'll do is the things that kind of, sit in the pattern on the offbeat notes, we'll make those have some random movement and stuff. Let's go ahead and maybe put in an open hat. Okay, cool. So if we're on the hat that we want, and we will click sequence mode, right? We can just put in an open hat, okay? And you could put that any pattern you want, you know. Cool. Let's do the same thing with the modulator on this one. We'll make sure that we're on the open hats, right? And we'll go back down here to pitch, sample and hold. And we'll change this maybe to like speed 25 maybe. Okay, so you can hear what we're doing basically, but we don't want, you know, something quite as dramatic as that. Maybe just something real subtle here. You can barely hear that it's doing anything, but it's doing something. And that's exactly what we want. These little tiny bits, I just sort of think of as just little tiny bits of polish on your beat. And when you do a lot of polishing in little tiny amounts, it adds up to, you know, a really polished beat, you guys. Let's go ahead and exit here. Let's see maybe what else we could put in. Maybe I'll put in a shaker where this symbol is. So we'll make sure that part 16 is selected. I'll click the wave. I'll go to hi-hats and scroll down to find like a shaker. Cool. And let's see. I kind of like that. Let me just make sure it's selected. I'll click sequence. And maybe I'll put it in on these notes. Cool. And what let's do is let's edit these notes in the little editor window up here. I can, you know, adjust the gate time, the velocity, the time shift, the stroke, and the step trigger condition. Okay. Now let's get some velocity happening on these. Some, you know, variation, I mean, some velocity variation. Cool. And we'll leave that last. Actually, let's bring this one back to like 66 as well. And then if I click in the step condition, we can do the same thing with these that we did with the other hi-hats, which is make them not trigger every time or hardly ever even. It's up to you. What we'll do is make these like 30. And these ones like 40. There's no, you know, right or wrong to this, and we may adjust these as we play it back and decide whether we like it or not. We'll go ahead and assign that shaker sound to the send effect, so get some reverb on there. Sounding good, cool. Maybe we'll take the panning on those shakers and bring it like 10 to the left to create a little bit of stereo width in our mix, you know. And maybe we'll, on the open hat, maybe we'll pan that a little bit to the right to, you know, to really push that stereo separation in the mix. Cool. And we'll save here. Let's go ahead and add like a, you know, some sort of a snare. So we'll go make sure we're on the snare, and we'll go to the sequence mode. We'll put that on 5 and 13. Maybe we'll put that on a 16 and 15 as well, and do some interesting step conditions here. Maybe we'll make these last ones, like, again, barely ever happen, right? So like if we hold shift, we can do you know, any individual settings we want. It doesn't have to be just multiples of 10. So I can make this first one like hardly ever happen, right? 5% of the time that snare will hit. And we can make this one hit like maybe 10% of the time. But these snares will hit all the time. And on these, when they do hit, we want them maybe a little more subtle in the mix. So I'll bring these down in the mix also. And now, just every now and again, these notes will sort of trigger and, you know, help keep our beat in a living, breathing, moving fashion. Let's do the same thing with the kick drum. If I go to, just scroll these arrows here to the parts, we don't even have to leave a menu. I can just, you know, change parts. And let's put a kick drum. Let's say we go back into, go out of edit mode. and put a kick drum on these same, two notes. But we barely ever want that to happen, right? Like barely ever. So we'll go back into the sequence mode here, and we'll tell this one on the, we'll leave that step velocity the same rather, but we'll change the step condition. You can see that the note is highlighted there, and we'll make this happen like maybe 10% of the time, and this one here as well. Actually, maybe both on these like 5, or I don't know. Let's see here. Let's maybe make these like 8% or something. But I do like to make stuff different, so let's make this 7. Okay, cool. Now these will barely ever happen, but we're not really in control of when they happen. The random algorithms are in control of when they happen, and that's pretty cool to me. So let's make sure we save. I like to put in like a ride a lot of the time, so let's see maybe what that sounds like here. Bring that back into mix, and we'll do some scrolling and find something that we're... Actually, maybe we'll select a different sound for the snare first. And let's see here. We'll click the wave button. Kind of like that one. If we go over here and pitch, we might be able to tune that to our beat a little better. Kind of liking the way that sounds. We'll bring this volume down maybe just a tiny bit so that the clap is a little more prevalent than the snare drum. Cool. Now let's put in like a ride part. So to do that, we'll make sure that the ride is selected. We'll click sequence, right? And on the downbeats, 1, 2, let's see here. That sounds pretty good for the pattern. What let's do is we'll edit the velocities of these and do some trigger conditions as well. Let's bring the velocity on every other one down just a little bit to create some, movement in the pattern itself. Okay, and let's tell these second notes in the step condition to not trigger all the time, right? Maybe only 60% of the time these offbeat ones will trigger, and that'll give us some more movement in the pattern right off the jump as well. Put some reverb on this. And bring it back in the mix. Okay, and now maybe we'll exit the menu and save. And what we could do would be to put maybe some movement on that with a modulator. We'll make sure that our ride is selected, and we'll click modulator type. We'll scroll down to that pitch, sample, and hold beats per minute again. We'll set this to like maybe 20. Again, this is all just personal preference. I'll crank up the depth so you can hear what it's doing to the ride here. You hear that it's, really randomly changing that ride pitch. Think of how you could use this in your beats, to this pitch modulation and the trigger conditions. Now, we're just going to use this really, really subtly, so we don't want, like, the ride just changing pitch all over the place. We're going to go, but that little bit of movement, I think, makes a really big difference. So here we've got it set to 15. Maybe even a little less, so that we're just barely hearing it. Super subtle. That sounds good. Now we can put a filter on this ride as well. It's set to off by default. We can choose like a high pass filter. And as we move the cutoff up and cut out those lows, you can really sculpt how this ride fits in the mix. We can maybe give it a little bit of panning to maybe like 15 left. Again, help that stereo separation in our mix. So what we've got here is a pattern that's sort of starting to move on its own, and when it puts in those turnaround kick drums, dun 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 and whatnot, it's all just sort of a moving, living, breathing sort of a drum part. If you take the time with the app to do these little tiny tweakies, Okay, let's just go ahead and do a double check on what parts I've assigned to the send effects for the reverb here. And we'll start back here on part number 9. Hopefully that's done there on the kick drum. Here we have a snare drum with no reverb. Let's put a little bit of reverb on this. Just a little bit. We're not trying to make like warehouse techno right now. If you were trying to make something like that, you might use a little bit of more reverb. It's all just personal preference. Here we have the clap, and I did not send that to reverb, so let's do that. I'm kind of liking a lot of verb on the clap here. Sometimes when I'm adjusting an effects, I'll, max it out and see like how much like it would sound if we, have way too much of that effect, and then I'll dial that back until it kind of sits itself in the mix, rather than just pushing it up until it sits in. If you overdo it first and then pull that effect amount back, it just sort of maybe like, I don't know, I find that it helps a little bit more to get the setting to gel in the mix. Yeah, I'm liking that for the reverb on the clap. Here's our hi-hat, and I've got reverb on that by this end. Okay, here's our open hi-hat. Put quite a bit on this to really put some high fizz over these drums, Maybe we'll bring this one down in the mix a little. This is our open hat. Maybe just really little. And maybe that ride could come down a little bit in the mix as well. Something else we might do on like, let's see, save on like maybe the hi-hat part. Okay, so we've got it changing pitch in sort of a random way, and we've got it, triggering the actual hi-hat sound in sort of a random way. Let's go into the I see. Right. Let's go into the internal effects, which by default is set to off. Let's turn it on, yeah. And let's scroll all the way down. We'll make sure that we're on the part that we want to be on, and scroll all the way down here. And we'll click Sidechainer. And now, the more I click the internal effects edit, the more sidechain we'll have on these hi-hats. Check this out, you guys. Mute some of the other tracks so that you can hear what I'm talking about. So basically, what we've done here on these, there we go, on the sidechainer, is we're really like sidechaining is taking it off the downbeat, right? So letting that kick drum punch through. So if we bring this to say just a subtle amount, like 50. You're not really hearing a dramatic pump effect, but we are doing some side chaining to these hats, which is kind of a fun thing. Cool. Let's go ahead and rename this from symbol to what it actually is, which is a ride. So if we go to part, okay, and if we go, let's see here, and we scroll down at the bottom. Okay, we'll make sure that we're on the right part. See, right now I'm on part 13, but what I want to affect is the symbol here on part 15. So I'll make sure that I'm on that, and it'll say, symbol 707 ride there. And then if I scroll down, and I can click this label button, and I can call this ride. Whoops. Okay, and that's a lot easier to keep track of if things are actually labeled appropriately. So for instance, this one here is now our open hat. So I'll make sure that, that it's selected, part 14. And I'll double click this, and I'll call this open hat. Cool, and we'll save. And let's see here. Okay, I put our shaker here, but it says hi-hat, so we'll go ahead and make sure we're on part 16. I'll double click this, we'll call this shaker. Sounding pretty good. Let's go ahead and save here and exit the menu. I definitely like a little bit of percussion in my beats here. So let's maybe unmute this track here. Go to trigger and go to wave and go to percussion and maybe find something that we like. That's pretty cool. Let me just play that in and we'll do some step editing and affect the trigger conditions and stuff. Cool. Dope. Okay, so right off the jump, let's just bring the volume on that part down a little bit. And let's go into the modulator section, and we're going to scroll down, bed down to that pitch, sample and hold, BPM again. I'll set the pitch to something relatively slow, maybe a little off from the other ones though, so we'll go with 23. And I'll crank this up so you can hear what it's doing to the sound. Really just randomly shuffling the pitch around there. So you can, have some really extreme, randomization stuff happening if you want, guys. But we're going to bring this down to maybe like 40. Maybe even a little, really subtle. That's pretty nice. Put some reverb. Okay, so let's see here. On that percussion sound, we'll make sure that we're on part 10, and I'll go to the internal effects, right? We'll scroll down to the bottom, and I'll select Sidechainer. We'll turn the internal effects on, and I'll turn this up to, say, 50, and we'll get a little bit of sidechaining happening on that percussion sound so that the kick drum punches through the mix just that tiny bit better. It's just a tiny, tiny subtle polish. Bit more side chain, and we'll pull our hi-hat, our closed hi-hat rather, down in the mix just a little. Nice. And on this percussion sound that we just put in, let's pull that down in the mix and give that some panning to the right maybe for some stereo separation. And now let's, go into the sequence, and we'll make sure that we're on our percussion, that we just put in here. And we'll click Edit, and here's our, steps here. And what we can do is we can we can make these not trigger every time. So I'll make these first two 30%. I'll maybe make these here like 60%. Maybe... that's hitting on the snare, so maybe we'll leave those consistent so that it always hits and our rhythm doesn't get too random and still, it's still like a driving rhythm. We'll make this maybe 50 and maybe make this something different. Maybe make this like 20, and let's see what this sounds like. Now this is just a 1-bar pattern still, you guys, but because of these, step trigger conditions, we're getting lots of movement happening so that it really sounds like something that's a longer pattern and more of an evolving pattern than just a, boring 1-bar loop. Okay, let's see here. One of the things I like to do to get the most volume out of this app as well, guys, is to go over, once I've got something programmed like this, I might go over and then, double check on my master channel that the limiter is not, clipping, being pushed too hard in the red. And I might, maybe try to push this an extra decibel if we can. So let's see what happens if I do that. And we'll see about when that limiter lights up, and I'll back it off a little. Okay, so see it's, the little red was, turning on there. That's pushing it too hot. So what I'll do, Okay, you can hear and you can see that I was able to get just a little bit more volume out of it without actually clipping or, pushing the limiter too hard. That may change as we, add like a bass line to our track or, put in more parts. But for now, where it's, sounding pretty good, I'm pretty happy with that. What do you think, guys? I'm really liking this app.